Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. The Holocaust Center, located in downtown Seattle, sits on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people. Evidence of the Coast Salish people in this region dates back to 2000 BCE. We remember and recognize the original inhabitants and stewards of this land on which we now live. To help support Holocaust education and preserve the stories, we are giving away one of our new graphic novels that features the story of local Holocaust survivor Steve Adler. To tell you more is my wonderful colleague, Julia Thompson, our Education Program Manager.
Hi, thank you, Alana, and thanks everyone for tuning in to this Lunch and Learn today. If you've been watching for the last couple of programs, you know that this is our third drawing for a prize copy of More Than Any Child Should Know. More Than Any Child Should Know is the Holocaust Center's first graphic novel written specifically for students. It relates the story of local survivor Steve Adler and his journey from Germany to England on a kinder transport and finally a new home in the United States. So we are drawing our winners from a pool of educators who've used a Holocaust Center resource or attended one of our programs since the school year began. So let me use my random number generator. Always a little fun and magical. One moment, please. Okay, so today's winner is Paula Bazinet from New Horizons High School in Bremerton. So congratulations to Paula, whether or not you're tuning in today. We will reach out and make sure that you can receive your copy shortly. If you're interested in purchasing your own copy or borrowing one of our classroom sets of More Than Any Child Should Know for teaching, you can find more information on our website, and you can purchase from your local independent bookstore via IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, and more. So thank you again. Congratulations, Paula. I'll hand it back to Alana to continue our great program today.
Thank you so much, Julia, and congratulations to Paula. Our eyes and hearts turn to the catastrophic horror unfolding in Ukraine, a land with a tragic and complicated past and present. Ukraine, the land of the pogroms from which my ancestors fled. Ukraine, where millions starved to death in the Holodomor, the man-made Soviet terror famine. Ukraine, the land of the Holocaust by bullets, where the Nazis, with the help of their collaborators, many of them Ukrainian, killed over 1 million Jewish women, men, and children. And Ukraine, the democratic state bravely resisting the Russian onslaught, led by a heroic Jewish president, the grandson of Holocaust survivors. Despite the political and historical complexity of the current war, these truths shine out. Aggression and unprovoked warfare are wrong. Truth and freedom must be defended. We at the Holocaust Center stand with the Ukrainian people in their desperate struggle for independence and peace. Today's program is the first in a series of 6 entitled Understanding and Disrupting Genocide. When considering this series, I was challenged by many questions, including the relevance of the rallying cry, "Never again." A popular refrain after the horrors of the Holocaust, the world swore we would never let this happen to a people again. But the phrase falls flat in reality as genocides have wiped out people around the world. How can we understand our good intentions in the face of violence? Are there ways that we could actually make never again a truth? Are there patterns to genocide that could be recognized and consequently interrupted? And on a human level, how do we help the victims of genocide? I'm honored to have with us today the 2 acclaimed co-authors of the book, Voices from Srebrenica, Survivor Narratives of the Bosnian Genocide. Hasan Hasanovic is the head of the oral history team at the Srebrenica Memorial Center and a survivor of the Srebrenica Genocide. Hasan survived the genocide, but other family members did not, including his twin brother and his father. He educates thousands of visitors each year at the memorial and is a frequent speaker at events around the globe. In addition, he coordinates an oral history collaboration with the Shoah Foundation on behalf of the Srebrenica Memorial Center. Ann Petrila is a professor, the coordinator of global initiatives and director of Global Practice Bosnia at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. Every summer, she leads an experiential Bosnia-based course, an internship program for University of Denver graduate students, and has taken close to 300 university students to Bosnia. She is dedicated to raising awareness and telling the truth about the genocide in Bosnia. Hasan and Ann will take questions at the end of the program. Today is Bosnian Independence Day. Bosnia gained its independence in April 1992. Bosnia's history is a complicated one, and to help provide some context for the stories and information our speakers will be sharing, I'd like to provide you with a brief overview of the history. Bosnia and Herzegovina, typically referred to as Bosnia, is a small and beautiful country which was part of the multi-ethnic former Yugoslavia. In 1991, following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the Bosnian Serb Army, which I'm going to refer to as the BSA, with the support of Milosevic in Belgrade, Serbia, launched a brutal 3.5-year war of aggression against the sovereign country of Bosnia. They embarked on a campaign of terror, destruction, and mass murder intended to ethnically cleanse the non-Serb populations of the country. The BSA laid siege to the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo for 3.5 years, ultimately killing over 11,000 inhabitants, including more than 1,600 children in the city. By the end of the war, more than 100,000 people were killed in Bosnia, the majority of them civilians. In eastern Bosnia, the violence was especially intense, where tens of thousands of Muslim civilians were forced to flee their homes and to seek protection in the small town of Srebrenica. From 1992 on, Srebrenica was under constant attack from the BSA. Without access to food, proper housing, or basic medical supplies, the humanitarian crisis continued to worsen. In April of 1993, Srebrenica was formally declared an official safe area under the protection of the United Nations. International troops were stationed at the UN base in the nearby village of Potocari, and a temporary ceasefire was mediated with the BSA, a ceasefire that lasted for less than a year. The violence continued to escalate, and Srebrenica fell to the Bosnian Serb forces under the command of Mladic on July 11, 1995. Before a throng of international journalists, Mladic made no secret of his intention to violently reclaim the territory for the nationalist project of Greater Serbia. That night, around 12,000 Muslim men fled through the forest in an attempt to reach free territory. Well over 2/3 of the men who started on this journey, which would become known as the Death March, were eventually captured and killed by the BSA. Meanwhile, more than 26,000 refugees took shelter in and around the UN base, believing they would be protected. However, the BSA quickly assumed control of the compound, facing no resistance from the UN Dutch battalion stationed there. In addition to shortages of food and water, the Muslim civilians faced unspeakable abuse at the hands of the occupying soldiers. Shortly thereafter, the BSA began to separate men and boys from their families. Thousands of women, children, and elderly were loaded onto buses and forcibly deported. Over the next several days, the more than 8,000 men and boys who had been captured in the Death March were transported to numerous mass execution sites and slaughtered. Their bodies were dumped in an elaborate network of mass graves in a sophisticated operation designed to conceal the criminal evidence. Formerly ruled a genocide by multiple international courts, the crimes committed in Srebrenica in July 1995 constitute the most horrific massacre to take place on European soil since World War II. Despite overwhelming forensic evidence and the unanimous rulings of the courts, denial of the Srebrenica genocide persists to this day, more than 25 years after the violence. In November of 2020, the book Voices from Srebrenica by Ann and Hasan was published. This book was a true labor of love and not without its challenges. Ann, I'd like to start by asking, can you tell us about how this book came about?
First of all, thank you, Alana, for such a gracious welcome and for you and your staff for hosting us today. It's very timely that we're having this discussion now. As you mentioned, today is Bosnian Independence Day, and we are witnessing another unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation with a democratically elected government. This morning on CNN, Christiane Amanpour, who was a chief CNN correspondent in Bosnia in the 90s, spoke about the siege of Sarajevo, the attack against civilians throughout the country, and the genocide which ultimately occurred during her news coverage this morning from Ukraine. I was also struck by how little many people in the US know about Ukraine, which was also the case in Bosnia. As for me, I clearly remember on July 13th, 1995, I was driving to teach a class at the Graduate School of Social Work and was listening to a segment on National Public Radio about reports coming out of Bosnia focusing on the fall of Srebrenica and the unknown fate of thousands of missing men and boys. And now, over 25 years later, I no longer have to wonder if those men and boys were ever found, because I have the privilege of now calling Bosnia a second home, and I know all too well what happened in Srebrenica. Though it's a horrifying story, it's one that we all need to hear. And there is no better way to hear it than from those who survived it. The first time I went to Srebrenica, I met a Bosnian man who had just started working at the Genocide Memorial as a curator. He had survived the genocide and spent his days telling the story of what happened in Srebrenica, as well as his own personal story. His name was Hasan Hasanović, and I couldn't know at that time that he would become a colleague, a dear friend, and a partner in writing this book. I'd been taking students each summer to Bosnia for several years when I realized I needed to gain a greater understanding of the war and the genocide if I was going to be teaching others about it. I took students to Srebrenica every summer, where Hasan was always our teacher. I asked him to recommend a good book about Srebrenica, and he told me that the book I needed didn't exist, and certainly not in English. He said if I could find a way to spend a few weeks with him in Srebrenica, he would teach me everything that he could. And accepting that offer was one of the best decisions that I have ever made. A short time later, Hasan invited me to join him and the women from the Mothers Associations on July 13th, when they visited the main execution sites around Srebrenica and memorialized them with prayer, flowers, and remembrance. These sites include a warehouse, fields, schools, a large dam, and a cultural center. They are intentionally made difficult to visit and contain no markers identifying them as execution sites. In buses, we wound our way around the roads visiting execution sites, and I wondered how anyone could find these places on their own when Hasan told me that they couldn't. As you can imagine, visiting these sites for the women was excruciating. Their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and other male relatives had been executed there. It was a time when I was in the presence of such raw and unimaginable grief. I felt so honored to be there, but I wasn't sure it was my place to be. That is a question I've asked myself countless times in Bosnia. Should I be there in such intimate moments in a culture that is not my own? The questioning of how to ethically work cross-culturally is something that should never stop. As we listened that day to a young man named Nejad talk about his survival in the school where he had been imprisoned and at the dam where he was only one of 2 survivors out of 1,500 who were executed there, I began to think about how his and other stories of survival could only be heard by those fortunate enough to spend time in Srebrenica. Then we made the last stop at the Pilica Cultural Center, where Hasan's father had been killed, which is the worst place I've ever been in my life. For those of you who have seen our book, it's the cover photo. It's like the set of a slasher film, except it's real and it feels haunted. There's a stage where the 500 men and boys who were trapped there tried to hide, which was impossible. You can still feel their fear. There were no survivors from this site. It was there that day that Hasan and I decided that we needed to tell the stories of those Excuse me, I'm sorry. Had a little tech glitch there. It was that day that we decided that we needed to somehow preserve the stories of those who survived and those who didn't in a way that could reach a larger audience. There were so many people who know so little about Bosnia and who had never heard of Srebrenica. That's how the journey of writing this book began, a journey that took us 5.5 years from start to finish. Originally, we wanted to write a book that contained a great deal of factual information about Srebrenica before, during, and after the genocide. And we hoped to tell the story of the 10 survivors of the execution sites. Of the thousands of men and boys taken to these sites, only 10 survived. All along, we knew that we wanted to write about survivors' experiences using their own words and their own narratives, if they were interested in their stories being told in a way that could possibly reach beyond Bosnia. We realized that it wouldn't be possible to talk with all 10 of the survivors for a number of reasons, but we were able to talk with several. In thinking more about our goal of preserving oral histories from survivors, we realized this book would be far richer if we expanded our idea. When we added more people to the list of those we hope might be interested, they included those who survived the genocide and the death march, like Hasan did. We also included women who had lost some or all of their male relatives and who are now alone, as well as others. We kept adding people, promising that we wouldn't add any more, breaking that promise over and over again. And if the truth be told, it was always Hasan having an idea about adding somebody and me saying we couldn't. And then we did, and it was always the right decision. At the very beginning, when we talked about writing this book, I was so honored Hasan wanted to do this together. It's his country and his culture and his story. Yet he invited me to partner with him to do it. I felt a great responsibility to get this right, and we did our best to do so. As I was trying to get my head around what we were hoping to do and how we might do it, and the ethics involved and on, Hasan had already gotten on the phone and contacted most of the people who ultimately ended up in this book because he knows them all. They knew Hasan and they trusted him without exception. And by extension, they trusted me. When Hasan explained what we were hoping to do, to my surprise, but not to Hasan's, every person eagerly agreed to talk with us and gave us permission to include their stories in this book. They all said that they wanted to talk to us, wanted us to tell their story of what happened because people need to know, especially because there's a tremendous culture of denial, including sometimes from their own neighbors who were perpetrators of the genocide. They wanted their stories to be told and to be believed. It was, not surprisingly, very difficult for people to tell these stories. We always gave them multiple options to stop, but they all wanted to continue despite how hard it was for them. That's how much they want the truth to be recognized. At the beginning, several people were protected witnesses at the War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague, and they wanted to remain anonymous. By the time we were close to publication, however, each of them requested that we use their real names because they wanted a public record of what had happened to them. We met with people in whatever place they chose. Sometimes it was in their home, sometimes in cafes or coffee shops or parks. We recorded the interviews and Hasan translated during those that were conducted in Bosnian. This resulted in hundreds of pages of transcripts that had to be turned into chapters. I told Hasan early on my goal was to write this book in a way that readers would get to know and to care about these people in the same way I did. I knew it wasn't okay to just write about the tragic parts of their lives for a couple of reasons. One is it's barely tolerable to just read about one atrocity after another. And most importantly, would not be fair to these incredible people. They are so much more than their tragedy. We tried our best to learn about their lives before the war, what they thought they wanted to be when they grew up. But for many of them, it was seemingly impossible to talk about much other than the genocide and their sorrow. I think we succeeded in presenting these narratives that not only include tragedy and sorrow, but also senses of humor, generosity, hopes, dreams, determination, and certainly resilience. In addition to the personal narratives of survivors and enough history to provide a context for these stories, we've also included information about verdicts from the ICTY War Crimes Tribunal, the psychological ramifications of intense, individual, cumulative, and collective trauma, including organized and pervasive sexual violence, primarily against women, and the responsibility of the international community, in particular the United Nations. In closing, I would like to say it was very important for us to include lessons learned from Bosnia in this book. What happened in Bosnia can happen anywhere. the role that nationalism, propaganda, media control, assaults on the press, and a pervasive system of lies and dehumanizing language stoked such hatred that thousands of people were convinced to slaughter thousands of their neighbors and fellow citizens. Genocide just doesn't suddenly happen. All genocides follow the same stages and include these things just mentioned. It's crucial for each of us to pay close attention when hate-based, dehumanizing language riles people up in a dangerous way, and to things like Muslim bans and other policies designed to denigrate a particular group of people, not to mention intentionally false information being delivered as factual news. For the past several years around the world, we've experiencing a rise in extremist right-wing ideology and are seeing the direct connection between dehumanizing language and violence against people based on their identities. We continue to see the danger of revisionist history. Not only do we need to pay attention, but we each need to figure out what our responsibility is for addressing human rights violations in some way as soon as they begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. What a powerful pair you and Hasan make to create this book. Hasan, if you're willing, could you share with us a few moments of your personal experience with this genocide and why you decided to work on this book with Anne?
Hello, everyone. First of all, let me thank you for your willingness to organize this book launch for us tonight, to raise awareness of the Bosnian War and Srebrenica Genocide. So what I'm actually going to tell you now is, in short, is in this book, my stories among other stories in our book. So I was born in a village which is approximately 25 kilometers from Srebrenica, on the Bosnian, very close to River Drina, which is a natural border with Serbia. My mother gave a birth to me and my twin brother Hussein. We lived in that village, and it was a very peaceful village and a beautiful village. Above all, my grandfather and father used to work in Croatia, and it was up to us, me and my two brothers and my mother and grandmother, to work the fields and to try to take care of land. And I was spent most of the time working, helping my family. But I did have some time to play with other children. So what we produced in our village, we call today organic food. Everything, we actually produced everything for our own needs in terms of fruits, vegetables, other foods. At the time I thought that I would be forever stuck in that village and that I will never see the rest of the world. And I was not even aware how happy I was in that village, which I'm actually very aware of now. I really had to do a real long hikes to my schools. At the time, even during the stone drifts, during the floods. But going back in time now, it seems to be really fun, and talking to my daughter and to other kids today, for them it seems to be very much unreal, what I had to do at the time. So then, when I was finishing my primary school, I had to move to another town because my father built a house there, and I had to continue the schooling. I had to start with the secondary school, so it was impossible, to do that in my near my village. So we as a family we moved from the village, but my parents from both sides remained in the village. So I would come on the weekends to visit them, and it was very difficult to adapt to a new environment because I am a village boy, and I was a village boy, so it was real difficult to adopt in living in the suburb, with the new new friends, new neighbors. At the time, situation had dramatically changed back in Yugoslavia. We lived for many years under the motto of brotherhood and unity. We were Yugoslavs. We had Yugoslav identity. We were like brothers and sisters. Our fathers were, schoolmates, army mates. All of a sudden, because of upcoming war, there was a really severe propaganda, mainly coming from Milosevic, based on ethnicity, based on religion as well, and some other aspects. So the point of the propaganda was to turn neighbors against one another. So it was really difficult to imagine that neighbors would turn against one another. So as Muslims, where I lived, we were really in such a difficult situation because we had no weapons. We knew that Serbia, with Milosevic, had really powerful army. They hijacked Yugoslav People's Army. So we knew that we were in a big problem. So when the war started, basically I had to run from my home. I left everything. I kept changing places, and I actually came to Srebrenica, which was a territory where the resistance happened from the side of the Bosniaks, Muslims, because the territory of the eastern Bosnia was being occupied, and it was almost completely occupied, except for those three places, Srebrenica, Žepa, and Goraž, the three isolated islands where the resistance had happened. So I was able to find my shelter in Srebrenica, in one of those three safe areas, safe pockets. Put it maybe in a more understandable context. So I spent 3.5 years in Srebrenica, living under the siege, with no food, no water. I lived in my uncle's apartment. There was no electricity at the beginning. I did not go to school for 2 years. We survived shellings on a daily basis. I felt I was very afraid. I had still to go outside to bring water from the water springs. I had to chop wood and to bring it to the ninth floor where I lived, because I wanted to protect my mother. My father was a defender on the position, and my twin brother was living with my grandmother and grandfather, helping them, and my younger brother was just a small, a boy. He was a small boy, so I had to basically do all the things regarding our daily life for my family, and I had to put my life at stake every day. Every move you would make outside of the place where I lived was was life-threatening. As now you can see on what's happening now in Ukraine. How people, except for the fact that they are being attacked, they still have to live. They have to do the daily routines, which is very dangerous. So when the Bosnian Serb army, when they tightened the siege around Srebrenica, and Srebrenica was about to fall in March 1993, we were hoping for international protection. And at the time, there was a really severe starvation in Srebrenica. I had to go into the forest to try to fetch food, which was being parachuted from the air by NATO planes, and it was also very dangerous. And sometimes I would bring food to my starving family, and I was very, very happy, very, very proud. And all of a sudden, I had to be very mature, very responsible for my family. And I would come soaked wet, and even during the snow drifts, it was cold. Everything was beyond difficult. So many refugees were in town, coming from everywhere, fleeing from the occupied territories. So one day we actually heard news that Srebrenica will be protected by the UN, which was actually a promise given by the UN commander. And because of that, I went a couple of weeks later to play football on the playground, and fortunately it was being shelled, and I sat on one of the bleachers watching my friends play football. And I am one of the rare people who survived the massacre. When they shelled playground, 74 teenagers were killed and over 100 were wounded, and which is a trauma that I have actually to live to the rest of my life. I saw, beheaded people, armless, legless, some of my friends, massacred. And I thought that would be the end of my tragedy, the end of my suffering, but that was unfortunately just the very beginning. Well, I was not aware and didn't actually know that I would actually have later to survive the actual genocide, which was something that a human being will never be able to comprehend. After the massacre, Srebrenica was proclaimed as a safe area with a UN resolution. So it was a little bit later, food was coming. I was able to go back to school. I tried to get back to, normal. I played music with my friends. We were going out. And in July 1995, Srebrenica was attacked again in spite of the UN presence. We had the 1st Canadian Battalion, then subsequently the Dutch Battalion of the United Nations. And in spite of their presence, Srebrenica was overran and fell. And I will never forget that day when I had to leave Srebrenica and part from my family. My mother, younger brother, grandparents moved to the UN base in Potocari to seek protection there, while I, with my twin brother, my father, my uncle, had to take the path through the forest, which we call the Death March, and I'm the only one who survived. So at just the very beginning, when the shooting started, around the midnight, I lost the sight of them, and I never saw them ever again. And I spent at least another 5 days and 5 nights running for my life. I was being hunted by soldiers. I was almost captured twice. And I basically ran away from soldiers running after me, shooting. They were shelling from everywhere. I saw so many, wounded, killed. Some, even much younger than me. I was 19, but I even saw like 14, 15-year-old teenagers who were wounded. And there was no food. There was no water. I was afraid. I was very, very afraid constantly, thinking that this could not be the end of my life. I could not actually wrap my head around what was happening. And I thought it was just a bad dream. I just wanted to live. I was praying to God constantly, praying. And but some inner voice inside of me kept saying that, if I push forward, reach the front, I will survive, which actually, eventually that actually happened. And when I survived on July 16th, I was both happy and sad. Happy that I survived, and sad that many were left behind, including my father, my twin brother, my uncle. And I spent later a couple of weeks looking for those from my family who survived, and eventually I found them at Tuzla Airport. My younger brother, my mother, and my grandparents from the mother side, and spent about 2.5 months at the airport, living in a tent, UNHCR tent, surviving, that refugee life. And then we were transported to a place where we were given a place to live. And then I started to go to school again, and as if nothing had happened, and I had to pretend that, nothing had happened. I tried to study, which was very difficult. Later I became an interpreter to the U.S. Army when the Bosnian War was over, and then I became a student of criminal justice, and all those years I was looking, I wanted to know what had happened to my loved ones. I had later, that part of my life was life. In a way that I wanted to put everything behind me, to forget everything. I was, I had, normal life. And when I found out that my father was identified, I went with my girlfriend, my mother, and with some of my friends. I came to very close to the cemetery, to just a town, Bratunac, which is run by Serbs, and Bill Clinton was inaugurating the memorial that day, and because of that, there was a traffic jam, and the Serb police told us that we had to leave the bus and walk for about a mile. And as we were walking behind the police line, there was a really huge crowd of Serbs, spectators from the town, chanting, spitting on us, calling names, yelling out unbelievable insults. Even war criminals were there, which some of them recognized, spitting on me while I was going to bury my father. And I have no words to convey how I felt. I buried my father, and 2 years later, I had to bury my twin brother, which was the most difficult day in my life. I actually left my university for about 5-6 months, just preparing for his burial. I thought that I will not survive the burial. And I still had to be strong for my mother. What was very difficult for me was to put his bones in the actual grave. And my heart was pounding, and I felt destroyed both mentally and physically. In just about 4 years later, I returned to that place, this time as a curator. I wanted to share the story with the rest of the world. And it was at the beginning very difficult to share the story with visitors. And Ann told you some of the bits of how we met, and I was very happy that I actually met her and her students, and that we became friends. And I wrote my own memoir, which was also something that Ann had taught me into doing it. And later, apart from having my own story written and published, I wanted to be part of the book, which would tell much wider perspective of what had happened. And I wanted to write it with a partner, somebody who would be so respectful, and which Ann was, because we spent years working together, and I realized how much she cared about survivors, about the story, and having such an unbelievable heart. I said to myself, this is the only person that I could actually do this with, especially as she mentioned that she wanted people to see survivors with how, in a way, how she actually see them, and what she feels for them, that they would be able, by reading the book, they would be able to grasp this, which was enough for me to decide that we should do it. It was very difficult to write the book at the beginning, and to translate, to work on the transcripts, beyond difficult, but I had to do it, because that was something that I decided, and that was something that I wanted to do for victims, and then it was difficult to go to Belgrade, because one chapter was supposed to be about Belgrade, and I said no. Then later, because of my brother, journalist, who was a journalist, he said I should go. Then I decided to go, and which was very therapeutic to me, to go there, to confront with, the place. And I'm very happy that we have this very, successful book, which is really an amazing book about this genocide. And as what is very important, that the book covers all the issues that Ann mentioned, and the things that I actually wanted to mention, the issues of transitional justice, denial, glorification of war criminals, which I hope that some of the people from who are actually watching the program will maybe ask and want to know. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing this very painful and traumatic story. I'm sure it's never easy to tell, and probably even harder to try to describe it in 15 minutes, how much pain this is. I wonder, can you tell us how were you able to move back and continue living in Srebrenica, and how have you come to terms with the neighbors and the people around you who, as you and Ann both mentioned, there's increasing denial about these horrific crimes?
Yeah, at the beginning, when I started to work here, it was very difficult to confront with the place where the genocide happened, because the police is the same police which committed the genocide, and they're turning to a very hostile environment, which is anti this narrative, was very difficult. But I just wanted to do this to share the story with the world, hoping that things will change. The people who live here, they actually are not different from people living in this Bosnian autonomy called Republika Srpska, or from Serbia, because what they think is a collectively constructed narrative from the authorities and being served through media. So individuals, they basically believe what media says, and they don't have intellectual capacity to have any critical thinking. In spite of passing by the cemetery where over 7,000 victims have been buried, they still believe in what the media tell them, that it's just a Western propaganda against them as a people. And we are actually trying to do our best to make sure that we raise awareness of these issues, of denial. They don't just deny the actual genocide, they do everything to glorify the deeds committed by army and the police at the time. And war criminals are being portrayed as heroes, and it's actually, what is even more dangerous, it's becoming part of their culture, So this is something that they are actually teaching their children. So some of the war criminals are being role models instead of having footballers or actors or scientists. And it's difficult to do anything about that, because they have media, they have everything in their hands, controlling, keeping an eye on what people are doing. So us as the Srebrenica Memorial Center, we can only do our best to educate people, to raise awareness, hoping that things in future will change. But the key of this problem lies back in Serbia, when the Serbian regime changes, when they change their attitude towards the confrontation with the past in terms of transitional justice, reconciliation, there will be a chance for moving forward. And it is impossible to go ahead and think about forgiveness when there are all of these obstacles, because denial is a wall between the sides who should reconcile. And we have to reconcile and to move forward. And what is actually even more dangerous is that the influence of Russia here, because on daily basis we have the statements from Russian ambassador basically supporting this narrative, and they do more harm than help. Even sometimes even more harm than actually they don't do any help. They only do the harm, which is which we can do, which we can see what's happening back in the Ukraine. So I'm hoping that this country will find strength to move forward within, but we need help from the outside. We need help from the European Union, from the United States, in terms of exerting pressure on local stakeholders to confront with our past and move forward. And if we are being held back in past by these black forces, so I'm afraid that it's going to happen again.
Hasan, I have one more question for you, and then we'll turn it over to the people listening today if they would like to ask any questions of either you or Ann. But my question is, I wonder, I know there's few survivors of the genocide, and you are one of them. Are there others who are willing to share their stories like you? Share their stories publicly? I know they shared them for the book, but do they speak to groups of people?
Yeah, I remember. We have this really interesting event which is called the Peace March, which is organized in the honor of the Death March. So it's been happening since 2005. For 3 days, thousands of people, both domestic and internationals, walk for peace for 3 days from Tuzla back to Srebrenica, remembering the Death March. And I remember I had to speak for about 8 years, only all by myself, because other survivors were not ready to speak. So Ann mentioned Nejad, one of the characters in our book, as survivor. He is ICT eyewitness. So just about five years from now, he was able to speak for the first time, and he also spoke, internationally, and he was given a honorary doctorate from one of the universities from London. So there is a number of those survivors now, and who have written and published their own memoirs, and people speak both here and abroad, but not that many. As the memorial, I'm actually the head of the whole history program. So we interviewed about 300 survivors, and I only know how it is difficult to recruit, to find people who want to speak. And we could just have another program to talk about the reasons why people can or cannot speak, and which also Ann is sort of an expert on the field. So I'm really encouraged that there are more and more people who are really willing to speak about this.
Mm-hmm. I think of the many Holocaust survivors who it took many years for them to be willing to share these experiences. And 25 years wasn't so long ago. It's very recent history.
Yes.
So there's a couple of questions that have come that I just want to read to you. Let's see. One comes here, and I'll read it to you here. It says, do you have a recommendation how individuals in the local area who were raised by parents in law enforcement can identify opportunities to avoid genocide?
I think this is the question for Ann. I think she is the best one to respond to this question.
Alana, do you mind reading it one more time?
Sure. It's, do you have a recommendation for, this one says specifically for how individuals who were raised by parents in law enforcement can identify opportunities to avoid genocide? But I think we can broaden it out and basically ask, what can any of us do actually to step in and try to disrupt these patterns of genocide?
It's such a great question, and it's a question that I'm delighted people are asking, actually, and we all need to be asking. The first thing I think is awareness that that such things happen, and they happen in places that we may or may not be familiar with, to people who may or may not be similar to us, and that centers such as your own, Ilana, that are devoted to spreading awareness about the Holocaust and other such genocides and atrocities, So I think that raising awareness or being aware is one thing. The second thing is what I had mentioned earlier, is that we all have to, I think, realize what are the early warning signs for something that is happening that potentially will lead us down the path to even more human rights violations. And those warning signs are fairly easy to spot, actually, and they're also fairly easy to get sort of used to, and they don't seem so bad, such as hate speech, such as any kind of exclusion, where any sort of power differential where someone's trying to exclude another group. And I guess the other thing I would say is that any group who just is not able to control their own narrative because someone has stripped them of their power and someone else owns the narrative, that anything that we can do to partner with, to advocate for people who really have amazing voices that need to be heard, and how can we use our own privilege, our own power that we may have to partner with people to figure out ways for the truth to be told.
Mm-hmm. There's another question here that comes from Graham that a couple other people have asked also, and the question is, he writes, as an educator, I am curious if this tragedy is taught about in neighboring countries to Bosnia, those countries who were perpetrators but also bystanders to this tragedy. That's for either one of you.
Hasan, do you want to start?
I think you should answer.
Okay. I don't know if the question is about neighboring countries to Bosnia or in general, if this event is taught. I know that it's so complicated, isn't it, in terms of the political structure of Bosnia and some of the surrounding countries, and again of who owns this narrative, even though the factual events have been judicially determined to be true by The Hague about what did happen in Bosnia has been determined to be a genocide. But whether it's taught or not, I know it is not taught throughout Bosnia. It's taught in parts of Bosnia, but not others. It's certainly not, but the Bosnian genocide is not taught very regularly in programs in the US, even that are genocide programs, that it's one that gets missed, that often Rwanda is taught, which happened a year earlier, but not always Bosnia. I know with many of my students who either were maybe undergrad human rights majors or were very interested in genocide, many of them had not been taught about the Bosnia genocide. So that's one of the reasons why I teach about it and have developed these programs in Bosnia so that students can learn and again start sharing the word. But Hasan, I think you should talk about what's happening in Bosnia in terms of education.
So in terms of what's happening in this autonomy where I live, which is called Republika Srpska, which was created during the war by the Serbian Democratic Party, whose president was Radovan Karadzic, who was convicted in The Hague for genocide, and the most of his party, leading party members. As I mentioned, they live in denial, they live in glorification of war criminals. So of course, they don't teach anything about this genocide. On the contrary, they teach that they had a war for self-liberation of Serbs, and they celebrate their, those war criminals as heroes. So when it comes to Serbia, it's not very much different. It's basically the same thing, except for that, they even have a law on punishing those who deny the genocide, but not Srebrenica genocide. They only can prosecute if an individual, if there is a verdict passed by the Serbian court. And of course, it will never be passed by the Serbian court in terms of Srebrenica genocide. So they always use political power to distort facts, even within the judiciary. So basically, the children back there in Serbia, they don't learn anything. The students in the universities, nothing at all. So they basically have no chance to develop any critical thinking. The only they pick up something from the internet But having their parents, having the entire society on other side with a counter narrative, for them it's difficult to basically have different opinion, being bombarded by this propaganda, and then also sometimes probably being even confused. So as I mentioned before, if we would have a pressure from the European Union in confronting with our past for the better tomorrow, then this will and should be one of the priorities, educating children in schools about these facts, because as Anne said, it was judicially established as genocide, judicially established facts before the two UN tribunals in the Hague. So basically, there is nothing to that they should hide. I think it should be in their national interest to confront with this, and basically to get this off their shoulders and move forward. And unfortunately, they are not doing that. They are stuck in the past, and we are all basically trapped because of all this.
So it's almost as if because it's been recognized by the international tribunals, because it's been recognized as fact, what we almost need is an international curriculum that basically teaches students the same narrative, so that some countries aren't selecting a different historical story to teach their students.
I mean, definitely, what needs to happen is actually having, in my opinion, having all these countries, which I call civilized countries, to pass laws on incriminating denial of Srebrenica genocide. So even though it's different from one country to the other because of freedom of speech, etc., etc., but still, with these laws, you in a way narrow space for deniers and revisionists, and then you discourage them. And then, in a way, when after that, if educational ministries go ahead with a unique curriculum on Srebrenica genocide, so it will also narrow a space for this region here for those deniers and revisionists, and it can be done. It's what it takes is just the willingness. And right now we only have people like centers like your center and other Holocaust centers and some of the organizations talking about that, raising awareness, but not those who are decision makers in terms of wanting to have this as part of the school curriculum, which after 26 years since the genocide, and after the fact that chapter in the Hague Tribunal is closed, that everything has been established as the fact, so there is nothing to basically just wait for. So now it is now time to go ahead and create curriculums for schools and for universities, and basically just do the right thing.
So Hasan and Ann, in our last minute or two here, I have one last question for you, and that is just, what's one message you hope we all take away from this incredible book that you've written, Preserving These Stories?
And
I would say one message is that we all have a responsibility for doing anything that we can to guarantee that all people have basic human rights, and that human rights are not violated. And if they are being violated, then we each have to figure out what we can do, no matter how small, but what steps we can take to intervene, to advocate, whatever it might be, so that it doesn't progress further and doesn't cause even a bigger imbalance of power.
Mhm.
So in closing, I want to say that, the story of Holocaust, the story of subsequent genocides should be very, very important topic of all governments and should be one of the priorities in education. And it should and can never be an old story. So as we can see now, it's been happening every day from now and then. Today Ukraine, tomorrow God knows which country, and it is therefore it is very important that we speak about the Holocaust, we speak about all the subsequent genocides, to raise awareness and to basically have our representatives, political representatives, to basically be able to identify the symptoms of evil and do something in time before it's too late.
Thank you so much to both of you, and a special thank you to you, Hasan, for sharing this very heartfelt story and painful story with all of us, and for trusting us with your words. I love that you say it should never be an old story. I'm going to remember that. I think that's really, really important. And just I really appreciate you both taking the time to be with us today, and Hasan for joining us all the way from Bosnia as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana.
I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's program. This program was recorded and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow. I want to also thank our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors who helped to make these programs possible: the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. Programs like these are possible because of the generous support of our donors. And if you found today's program interesting, please consider making a donation to help support more programs like this one. You can make a donation quickly and easily on our website, and you'll find a link in the chat shortly. Our next Lunch and Learn program is on March 15th, and it's the second in this 6-part series, Understanding and Disrupting Genocide. On March 15th, we will hear from Emmanuel Turaturanye, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide and the newest member of our Speakers Bureau. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show. Also, a huge thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team: Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devin Shirelocke, Katie Lawrence, and Ali Laps. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn program on March 15th. This concludes our program for today.